Chalons, The Fate of Europe. This is not a new game, but it is a game that I can play in these trying times of the pandemic of early 2021. I've been spending some time on Board Game Geek looking for simple introductory level war games that I can play solitaire, the solitaire factor because I don't get to play with adults anymore, and the simple thing is because in times of quarantine I have so many work and family obligations that at the end of the day I'm completely exhausted and I can only play war games that are on the seriously easy side. I always enjoyed simple war games anyways, but I also enjoy to mix them up with more challenging stuff. These days, this is what I can play. So, Chalons, The Fate of Europe, 2-player game, perfectly playable, solitaire. You control both sides, the Huns and the Romans, and no problem whatsoever because there are a lot of die rolls, there are random elements, and there is no hidden information, so you can control both sides at the best of your possibilities and see what happens there. The situation, we are in the 5th century of the current era. The Huns are doing what they do best, running around, riding around, partying, looting, raising, all the good stuff until one day a remnant Roman army tells them that enough is enough, and they meet in the battlefield near Chalons. This is the map of the game. It is a paper map, and by the way, you probably noticed, but this is a folio game, so it doesn't come in a box, so it also travels well. Not that you should travel in times of pandemic, but for the future, good to know. The map may be a little bit unglamorous, but then, like so many battles in ancient times, they took place mainly in open space because they liked that. So they could preserve cohesion and all the good stuff. So, a little bit unglamorous, but perfectly functional. And yet, the few things that are here are really important because you have a hill here, which gives considerable defensive advantage, so you're gonna try to be on a hill when you're attacked by an opponent, possibly not on a hill, and you have this ridge in the middle of the map that also gives you those defensive advantage, counting as a hill. Plus, it is particularly hard to move from one side to the other, although not impossible. And that can be interesting as you try to move forces from one side of the battlefield to the other. Because basically, due to terrain, the confrontation will be almost two separate battles, again, or two battles almost separate, in case you want to invest in trying to cross the ridge or send cavalry quickly from one side of the ridge to the other. The Huns will set up there in that area. There you have their camp, and the Romans set up here at the bottom. So as you can imagine, the first couple of turns is going to be approaching, and that's very important. You're going to have more freedom, a lot more freedom during that phase, and then when the armies clash, it's going to be a lot harder to do crazy maneuvers. You can still move around, you can still reinforce gaps, open gaps, exploit those gaps, but of course a lot less mobility, and that makes sense thematically. And not by chance, this is a game with particularly sticky zones of control that simulates the fact that when enemies are locked in combat, then it's harder for them to do anything other than bashing each other. And so you're gonna have the situation here, and you really want to cover the entire line because there are going to be victory points that the Hun player scores for exiting units here, and that the Roman player can score for controlling the Hun camps. Which means, again, if you control everything only on one side of the ridge, then the other side can send some quick cavalry units to score those points. And so you're going to try to cover the entire line. You're going to try to anchor your flanks to the hill. So there's an important decision is to decide who goes on which side, and then depending on how the situation goes, you may have one side crumbling and the other side crumbling down the other direction, so it may look a bit like a swinging door. A lot of interesting situations here around one such simple feature, terrain feature, plus again this one here. But this is really, I would say, the defining element of this scenario. The forces in play are represented by these counters here. They're single-sided, and that already tells you one hit equal, you are gone. So many elements of this game reminds me of classic simple games such as Napoleon at Waterloo, possibly the quintessential introductory war game. And so what do we have here? We have military units with two factors, with a combat factor and a movement factor, bottom left and bottom right respectively. Some units also have a symbol that indicates they have missile capability. Sometimes it's tricky because the art shows that they have a little bow, but without the symbol it still means no missile capability. But here we have people that can use arrows. Actually, the kind of symbol that you have there also indicates the kind of weapon. So some have arrows, as you see there. Some have spears. Again, now I can't find a single spear one, but trust me, they're in there. So some have missile capability, and then we also have leaders that have a movement factor, that have a bonus that they give to the combat of the unit that they're stacked with. Some units also have a dot that makes them light units, and it makes them easier to move because, for example, they can exit zones of control that usually other units cannot. So, not a lot of information on the counters, but just what you need. Moving and combat. What else is needed? I'm gonna throw a couple of units there without worrying too much about whether they make sense or not. Usually stacking limit is 1, so that means that 1 unit per hex, again with the exception of the leaders that can stack and add their extra combat bonus to units of their own side. I would almost say if you play classic, let's call them classic, simple war games, you know how to play this one. Move, missile phase, combat based on combat odds, you're done. That's pretty much it. But, you know, suppose you want a little more detail, then I'm gonna give you a little more detail. So, in a turn, you will have first a side will move, and as they move, they can move up to their full movement allowance. Different kinds of hexes will cost different amounts of points. And as I said, zones of control are particularly sticky. All combat units will project a zone of control in the 6 axes surrounding them, and when you enter it, you are done. It's not even, well, next turn you can move from one to the other. Nope. Unless you are a light unit, the only way to exit from there is when you, as a result of combat, when you force the opponent to retreat, or as a result of combat you retreat, or as a result of combat you go and meet your ancestors on the other side. Very sticky zones of control. Units, as we said, have also some units, or a lot of units really, have missile capabilities. If they are within range, they can use that to attack the opponent's launch a missile attack. You can fire your missile units up to the range, and differently from other games, you can also fire missiles when you are adjacent to an opponent, just that then you have to be adjacent. If you're adjacent to an opponent, then you have to fire missiles to a unit that you're adjacent with. You cannot do crazy stuff firing at enemies that are away. Missile combat, you roll a 6-sided die, not included with the game, and if you roll basically a 1 or a 2, you will disrupt the opponent. Disruption here simply mollifies the opponent a little bit. It's a temporary situation that only applies to the upcoming combat phase. So during my phase, I move, I launch missile combat, I disrupt you. You'll be disrupted in combat, and then you will automatically recover. You flip a unit face down just to indicate that it's disrupted, and then when you resolve combat, you flip it face up again. But then you know that it will be at half of its combat value rounded down. So that one was disrupted during the missile phase. We'll fight with a 3. So that's all that missile does. No permanent damage whatsoever. It's all about preparing the punch that will arrive later. Combat is mandatory, so after the missile phase, you resolve the combat phase, in which everybody who is adjacent to an enemy must attack all adjacent units. Basically, every unit in a zone of control needs to fight. And in some cases, you get to choose who fight whom. For example, I could choose to send these two against that unit, or this one against that one against that one, maybe these two against that one, as long as at the end of the day, everybody that is in your zones of control gets attacked. To resolve combat is just as classic as it can be. You take into account modifiers, for example, terrain. When you're attacking somebody on a hill, the attacker is halved. When you're attacking somebody on a peak, the defender is triple, that sort of things. But it's very convenient that you have reminders about those game effects right on the board. Say here says entering a peak area, 3 movement points, and defender triple. So very convenient and not many modifiers. So once all the modifiers are taken into account, you divide the total combat strength of the attacker with the total combat strength of the defender. You turn that into odds of the kind like 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 1 to 2. Roll a die. Again, apply possible modifiers to the column. For example, if your army is demoralized, and then you cross-reference the result that you rolled with the column that you're using, and you will see if the defender retreats, if there is an exchange, so both sides lose 1 unit, if the attacker retreats, or the attacker experiences a loss, or the defender experiences a loss. Again, no reduction in strength, is all one-step unit. They're gone, they're there or they're gone. A loss eliminates a unit. That means an exchange will destroy 2 units, and very often that is in the advantage of the Han player, because in an exchange very often bigger Roman units go down with smaller Han units. And this is also important because the number of strength points that you eliminate, you may want to keep a piece of paper and a pen next to the board so you can keep a running tally of how many points you have eliminated from each side, because that determines when an army is demoralized. When the armies lose 150 points, they're demoralized, then they get a penalty in attacking. Or if you are able to eliminate these many combat points of the opponent, then the army disintegrates and it's an instant victory. You also score an instant victory if you're able to eliminate the leader of the opponent. Other than that, if those insta-victory conditions are not met, then you play until the end of the game, and at that point you score victory points, which again are based on elimination of enemy units and conditions that are based on different things, controlling or entering the enemy camp, exiting the south side, etc, etc, etc. You also have a limited ability at the end of each turn of rolling a die to try to bring back to rally units that have been eliminated earlier. But this is the general idea. Again, very simple. Turn after turn, player 1 moves, fires missiles, performs combat, mandatory, and tries to rally a unit. The other side does the same procedure, turn after turn, until either you have instant victory or instant defeat, or until the end of the scenario, in which case the player with the most victory points wins the game. I'm glad I picked up Chalons, The Fate of Europe. It's a game from about a decade ago, from one of the largest companies. Didn't have a lot of buzz about it, didn't have a lot of information. It just seemed simple and something that I could play by myself, and so it seemed perfect for the times of pandemic. This is definitely, and I'm glad that I did. It really actually did what I hope it would do. It fit my bill. Perfect game for pandemic war gaming. Simple, easy to set up, simple rules based on classic time-tried, time-tested concepts that haven't really failed me yet. I'm still happy with the combat odds. I don't have any gripes with that. So, solid, simple wargaming, reliable, very linear, very straightforward gameplay. That, however, is still engaging and still enjoyable because of an interesting situation. And that is exactly the kind of wargame that I need these days. 2 years, 3 years from now, maybe you'll get more reviews from me again about complicated war games. But who knows? Maybe by then it'll be too senile to go back to that style of wargaming. Anyways, I need simple wargaming these days, and Chalons is great. Again, because it's so simple. Move, fire missiles, calculate those odds, booyah, see what happens. But a lot of interesting things happen here. You really have the opening phase, in which the two armies are approaching, in which you're still wiggling around and figuring out where you want everybody to be. And then the main confrontation starts, but then it doesn't feel dull. It doesn't feel like you're just gonna go through the line, for 10 times, turn after turn, and just grinding. And there may be situations where not much happens. I retreat by 1 and you follow. That's it. And then I push you back and I follow you back. Not much. But then you're going to start sooner or later, just because you roll so many dice, having some exchange results, which start opening gaps. And then who is going to be able to exploit those gaps better? Who is going to be able to open those gaps and start outflanking the enemy? Who is going to be able to turn around the flank of the opponent, exploit the hill, etc., etc., etc.? Are you going to try to go across that ridge to reinforce the other side of the battle? And again, to me, that's really interesting. You have two mini battles here with some possibility of exchanging troops on one another, but not many. And so the two lines that will form after, the two fronts that will form after the initial clash, they start vibrating, they start looking like snakes, then they start collapsing. Some units will come back and you'll be able to reform them. So what you have is a situation that at first sight, if you were just looking at a picture, take a picture every turn, may look a little bit static, visually. But gameplay-wise, is actually very tense. Because although the two lines more or less look like they're always there, they get weaker in some points and not as weak in other points. So you always had the feeling that, although it may look static, there's a sense of tension. Because it almost looks like both lines are just about to collapse. Every time I switch sides as the Huns, oh my gosh, in this area I'm going to make them collapse here and exploit that. And I don't quite achieve that. Then I start looking at things from the points of view of the Romans. Oh, wait a second, look at that. Oh, they are doomed there. And maybe don't quite achieve that. So between the crumbling forces, the wearing out of those forces, that and also the fact that as you have fewer forces on the battlefield, then the turns become faster to play. So it's interesting because it really has a sense of progression, although it doesn't have so much inner variety. I felt pretty, engaged with the situation because the turns were shorter and shorter, and it felt like the stakes were increasing as both armies at the same time looked to be closer and closer to collapse. So very interesting situation, and to me it's remarkable that you can have such an interesting game, such an interesting situation with such a completely minimalistic core of rules and a map that's almost empty. It just has one region in the middle and a hill in the middle. And sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes that's all you need with a solid system of rules, with good victory conditions that give both sides intense incentives to play in certain ways. For example, to try to cover the entire map, to prevent the opponent from reaching areas in the back that will give you points. So between good incentives, good victory conditions, and very simple linear rules, and an objectively interesting situation, then you have a game that is incredibly simple to play, but really has a lot to offer. So I was very pleased with this one. This is just the style of war game that I need these days. I would have enjoyed it before the pandemic, I'm pretty sure. But it's even more special, even more important these weird days of pandemic, of say early 2021. I don't know, when you will watch this video, you will remember how it was back then. So, Chalons, Fate of Europe. Very simple, but absolutely very enjoyable. An introductory war game for sure. Maybe for some seasonal grognards out there, this will be a little too simple, too basic, but not for me. Good enough. I definitely enjoy playing this game. I'm not gonna lie about it. I find it to be a very enjoyable game, an excellent introductory war game. Excellent war game for beginners, but also absolutely enjoyable for somebody like me who played a war game or two in the past.